Hello, this is Michael Hexter, and welcome to Politics 2100 here on YouTube. So, this episode I'm calling Marxism's Anti-Liberalism is one root of post-left anti-imperialists, in quotation marks, pro-Putinist anti-Ukraine stance. So, sorry for all the sort of long words or epithets or sobriquets you could say in this title here for different kinds of left or political non-left but political description language here. But what I'm observing is, so there's what's relevant now is that we have arguments about Ukraine funding of the Ukraine war, both in the EU or in EU countries and also in the United States. And it divides pretty interestingly between centrist, in general, centrist and some left social democrats essentially being for Ukraine funding, and then and some conservatives, some people on the right, but most now the neo-fascist, alt-right, neo-right, quote-unquote populist right in I'm not happy with that word populist as it's usually applied only to right-wing groups, but in any case, so with those groups, as well as some segments of what's called the far left, or I'm calling them post-left because, and I'll tell you in a minute why, but in any case, these forces that have been identified with the left and are, among other things, pacifistic, or they use pacifistic language to encourage a cessation of funding for the Ukrainian military. And that is so this comes from both the far right, which is in de facto alliance with Putin, with Russia, and then also this post-left grouping that sort of makes its way through discourse. So even though in general, I would say in the course of American history of the last 30 years, the quote unquote left, or what was once the anti-imperialist left, it's not anymore, but was focused mostly on U.S. imperialism, had very little effect on public discourse, and didn't have any. There wasn't any pass through because there was a unity in the United States between the center left / centrist Democratic Party and the Republican Party on most issues of foreign policy, and so and stylized, often it became neoconservative since the 1980s, where that tended to be the dominant school. But in any case, there was unity on those two. And so that the left, the far left, or what I'm calling what was the far left, things have changed in the last 7 or 8 years. So we have a kind of a flux and a messy geography here, especially in this area of policy, foreign policy, and it's sort of, so there's lots of new language or different language to describe what's going on. But in any case, so we have now. The groups that are anti-Ukraine aid are the far right, and in the United States, this is the GOP largely, and then also parts of this group that claim they are not pro-GOP or pro-Trump, but nevertheless have seemed to be greatly encouraged by the rhetoric of Trump and by his apparent abandonment of the neoconservative, imperialist rhetoric, certainly, though in reality, when he was in office, he really didn't make many changes to U.S. policy. But in any case, his rhetoric and his talking up of being basically tired of being the world's gendarme, the U.S., and so he was tired of it, and so therefore this was encouraging to people who had for many decades been against U.S. imperialism in the United States, and saw an opening and a potential ally in Trump. So but who are also ashamed of it, who don't want to cop to it, so to speak. So anyway, so I'm sorry to go on about this, but it requires a few bits of background and so forth and so on. And in any case, so to so my stance is that we should be funding Ukraine's military and effectively and strategically, and also be encouraging EU governments to do the same, and for reasons of supporting Ukraine's ability to self-determine as a nation, and what kind of economic and political system they want to have in their country, and to not be dominated by their neighbors, and most notably Russia. And so and it's very hard to describe, it depends on who you're talking to, but in any case, that seems like, well, why isn't everybody for that? As it turns out, for all kinds of reasons, not everybody is. So I think then I want to go back a little bit to first a thought that I had, or thinking that I've had, and I've been working on a critique of Marx, and one of the elements of that critique is that Marx was at once inspired by the bourgeois revolutions, what I would call, or the liberal revolutions, you could say, of the early 19th century in Europe, and in also the revolutions of 1848. But at the same time, he thought that he had a one better way to, or that he saw the future, and he also saw the deficits in that project. Okay. And so he saw the problem was the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, who were undermining essentially the egalitarian and promise of liberalism, you could say, and or of the French Revolution and thereafter, and so and that this and their economic interests took over the fine words of the politicians, so forth and so on, so that he came to see history as a series of class conflicts between different classes, and that he saw that the working class, which was growing at the time, and also its misery was very manifest at the time, and so there was massive and clear exploitation. There was not the same kind of social democratic or weak social democratic protections for workers that we have in many developed societies. It was a very brutal process that he observed, and both he and Friedrich Engels observed. So and anyway, his idea then was that that there was going to be this succession of revolutions as one class took over and so basically his idea was that the bourgeoisie would have their revolution, that they would represent some form of progress for society, but they versus the feudal system or the aristocratic system that predated them, but they would fail in their highest goals, or it wouldn't necessarily be a failure for them if they were, in his view, accumulating capital and becoming wealthy and so forth and so on. And as we see after Marx, becoming quasi little potentates, so to speak, so little oligarchs, you could say, that wasn't part of his language in terms of what the bourgeoisie was becoming. But anyway, and he thought that then the working class would then take over and would essentially somehow improve upon the bourgeois revolutions and upon the liberal state that they produced, and that would produce socialism and then communism. And this change of this dialectic of history, he was Hegelian in his thinking, so there was this dialectic between classes. So that would create a society that was still better than, and would have all the virtues, none of the vices of the bourgeois society and or the capitalist society. And so he thought, and he had he was actually, among Marxists, he was more appreciative in a way of the bourgeoisie than some subsequent Marxists, or at least in terms of his rhetoric. And so, but we have the sense that in subsequent generations of Marxists, and also when Lenin actually made Marxism into a theory of revolution and created a political theory, or not really a general political theory, but just a theory of revolution, and then really didn't have any idea about how governing would happen, and it was sort of worked out in kind of a seat of your pants way in the formation of Soviets and formation of workers' councils, so forth and so on, and then kind of given up upon as the Soviet state, which Soviet is the word for workers' council, started to become basically a big command economy based on planning and so forth and so on, and so with a state being the sole or dominant political force in it, or an economic force in it too. So so the thing is that with Marx's thinking and then subsequent Marxisms, they ignored the gains that liberalism made in society, including having laws and a legal system, and also they assumed, in a way, the Enlightenment. They assumed that they, Marxists and communists, were the most enlightened, that they were simply the heirs to all of the best aspects of society. They were just going to democratize that. And it was an assumption. I mean, I'm not saying that people thought in the way I'm saying, but that the idea was they were progress, so they were going forward in time. And so by representing communism, or Marxism of a flavor that was similar to communism, or social democracy, but there wasn't a lot of thinking given to, well, what are the gains of liberalism and how can they be endangered, or how can they be, or are we Marxists or socialists building on the foundations of liberalism, of democracy, making it better and making it a system that creates economic democracy in society by incrementally, or if you need to have a revolution, but then create a society with laws and so forth and so on that regulate the society, that guarantee people's rights, including the rights that were considered to be the freedoms that even in early Marx wanted for everybody. And so, but that got lost. Okay, and there have been various efforts to recuperate that and libertarian. I called myself at one point a libertarian socialist, and so and sometimes people call anarchist that. I've never been an anarchist, but in any case, so there have been efforts to figure out, and so there's been a long. The problem is that the foundation in Marxist thinking, in adopting Marxism, and some of the class thinking in Marxism has spun out and away from Marx and Marxism, and in part that the idea that the class conflict and so forth and so on is in and of itself a motor of history and also inherently progressive and so forth and so on. We see, though, anyway, in the middle of the 20th century, and this is some revisionist history from me, but at least, others may have, I'm not totally reinventing a wheel when I say these things, but we had forces, fascism, that adopted some of the rhetoric and tools of. They didn't adopt the theory. They're not left. They didn't adopt the idea of socialism. The Nazis call themselves National Socialists, but it was a fig leaf, so to speak. It was a way to co-opt some of the ideas or the rhetoric, the rough and tough stance. Okay, so this was one of the things about Marx's theory, was that the working class were going to be the progressive force in society. So there was a workerist, that's a word from the long left tradition, which is not used very much, but in any case, a workerist culture of adopting the culture of the working class of your time as being the virtuous, the best expression of your society, or something to be emulated, something to be promoted, and it is part of there is sort of a populist, you could say, class conflict between different classes, have different subcultures, and so some often, and so there is always then this frictions between how one class thinks what's good, what's not good, or they think themselves as better than other. And certainly in a class society, the people who are quote unquote above are consider themselves to be better than the people who are not above. And so what Marxism does is it kind of inverts that and says, no, it's the other way around. So, but we have, though, fascism in the middle of the 20th century, threw some bones in the direction of sort of working classness, and there were actually early Nazis who, considered themselves to be quote unquote left Nazis, but they were Strasse was killed by Hitler, and so he was not. It was not part of the plan of the Nazi Party as it took power, but anyway, there is, though, in fascism and anti-liberalism, exactly. This is where we have an agreement in a way between current. So I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So anyway, we have many people now who do not call themselves Marxist or do not, or Leninists and so forth and so on, or whatever, who nevertheless have inherited, I think, this intellectual tradition and also tradition of, you could say, class resentment, class, or just not thinking about the benefits of liberalism, not in the persona of people who call themselves liberals now, but in the idea of national self-determination, which has been a key part of most revolutions of the 20th century, was national self-determination, which was really a liberal principle, but it became a left principle. It became capital C communist principle in the countries where they fought national liberation struggles. And then less so, though, is the freedom of individuals, the freedom of expression, the idea that the point is to become more free and to express oneself more, to become so those things are things that Marxism, Leninism, which, you know, capital C communism was the expression of from 1917 to, you know, I mean, in some very limited places today, but really, you know, kind of petered out definitely by 1991. But even before then, it had sort of just morphed into this different system that wasn't, you know, I mean, Marxism was really just this kind of religion, but it wasn't really. It is a motivating factor for people who are involved in the early parts of their struggle. But then this whole edifice of, in my opinion, erroneous, or not entirely erroneous, it's not all erroneous, but flawed ideas about the role of the state, the role of law, the role of individual freedom, the role of property ownership, and also material culture in terms of what the actual means of production, as Marx called them. What do they look like? How is that a political issue at all? What the means of production look like? Are they or how they're structured? The actual technical design of society and how it functions. So not just the relationship between an ownership class and a working class, but the design of not only the factory, not only the class elements of it, but just also the elements of how the material world is. So going to an eco-socialism, if you want that, and that's a high ideal, you would need to be looking at the way the flow of material and energy through the society to restructure it to be more sustainable, or to be sustainable, period, to be circular, as I talk about in Politics 2100. So anyway, so this anti-liberalism, so you had these movements. So after basically by the 1980s or so, you had basically Marxism not being a particularly dynamic force. There were some Marxist academics, intellectuals, so forth and so on, but really, and there are some regimes that claim Marx as being their inspiration, but they're not really, inspired by him anymore. And you have in China, while it's ruled by a communist party, much of the economy is structured, or almost all the economy is structured along capitalist lines, with sort of this dirigiste state that is managing something, doing some things in a largely non-democratic way. But so anyway, you have, though, generations of people on the left who were involved in fighting imperialism. So imperialism after the 1960s, or in the 1960s thereafter, became, because of anti-colonial struggles in the 50s, 60s, there became a role for people in the metropolitan world, or in the center, in the former colonial powers and rich countries, a role for them to try to eliminate imperialism, or to decry imperialism, or to express solidarity with movements that were trying to liberate themselves. By the way, national liberation, a liberal cause, okay? But in any case, but also most often through communist movements, because in part we had a bipolar world where there was a communist bloc, and then there was the capitalist bloc, led by the U.S. So anyway, so this dynamic of solidarizing oneself with opponents to the U.S. capitalist-dominated world system meant sympathy with, and maybe even adopting some of the attitudes and the dress, and going off and being, either here or in the former colonial powers, or going off and actually trying to fight with or aid the. I mean, that was very few people actually did that, but certainly there were some idea that was a very noble thing to do, and that the real people, were the people who were fighting U.S. imperialism abroad, and so or the people who would adopt their political position without any reflection, without any perspective on their position in the current society here. So basically going to big demonstrations, we've had, and there wasn't actually there also a theory of politics. How do we transform the politics of the former colonial or the current imperial power to be egalitarian, to be, and that word, by the way, is rarely used. How do we create egalitarian international relations? I mean, it's not a word that comes up in quote unquote this left anti-imperialist, because that's the goal, right? But that hasn't come up, because the idea was simply you just take the position of the other, so to speak. You identify with the other being the oppressed. In this case, the other is the oppressed a group who is fighting the U.S. in different forms. So that psychology is something that people like Putin, who is anyway a post-communist or a non-communist or anti-communist really, or a neo-fascist, great Russian imperialist, and traditionalist, okay, to Christo-fascist, you could say, he sees that attitude in people still percolating around the world in the developed countries, and he sees them as potential allies or potential dupes for him to manipulate. And again, people are freely choosing. I'm not saying that there's an instruction book that's sent out to people, but in any case, we have people who are enmeshed in a complex web of ideas that are tweaked, and one of the things that was tweaking them until not too long ago was RT, literally Russia Today. So I was always concerned that many left people thought that Russia Today was a neutral platform from them to talk about left-wing ideas in the United States or in other countries. And I thought, well, you're kind of undermining the sovereignty, the national sovereignty part of your idea, or certainly the rootedness of your thought in the United States by going on a platform like RT, even though, yes, the left, with a very few small exceptions, left journalists and ideas were systematically and are systematically excluded from the mainstream media, and also even some of the sort of intellectual media here in the United States. So anyway, but that again was part of not necessarily a master plan, but it was a strategy in a way of finding allies from the point of view of Putin, for Russia, and which was, felt itself sometimes rightly under attack in different ways, or rightly not in the sense that they're justified to do expansionism, but if Russia was victimized in the 1990s by the sort of U.S. Policy, or certainly it laid itself open to, and then allowed, with the former Boris Yeltsin's governments, to be decimated by dumb neoliberal ideas and by people like Jeffrey Sachs, among others. So So yes, there was a huge humiliation of Russia and of the former Soviet Union that occurred after it collapsed in the 1990s, and so so Putin draws from that sense of humiliation and so forth and so on, and so there are ways in which one can identify with that sense of post-Soviet, post-imperial being a collapse, and the huge the damage, the social damage that was done there, but then also one doesn't need to endorse Putin's solution to that, even though it became the solution because he became the dictator. So he is the uncontested leader of that country, and so and he has evolved, and one of his evolutions, unfortunately, has been to decide that to assert himself and assert his to assuage his wounded pride, or the wounded pride of Russians. They need to stamp upon and control, either remotely or the activities of Ukrainians. And this is, of course, there are U.S. interests and CIA interests that have also wanted to manipulate Ukraine in different ways. So that doesn't not exist, okay? But it's different to be a country on the border of a large power, and wanting to play off one superpower off the other. In this case, playing the U.S. against the Russians, who are right at your border, and who have put puppets essentially into your presidency after you gained your independence, so forth, so on. So there is clearly Ukraine is an area of dispute in between these two systems, and it is a for people who identified with and have identified with justification with the anti-U.S. coalition in the world, in the sense of those countries that are trying not to be dominated by the U.S. and its imperial ambition, its imperial power, its military might, and its economic might, and the economic might of the IMF and the World Bank, so forth and so on, and have engaged in all kinds of have been subjected to both economic warfare and also military war, or intelligence warfare, and then actual gunboat quote unquote diplomacy, or whatever, military intervention. So but in this case, you have a country that's right up against Russia. It has some shared cultural tradition with Russia, but is also a different country, and also wants to be a different country, wants to become something else. So that becoming is in part. So this is where the people who are in this post-left anti-imperialist group, they don't see that it's progressive for Ukraine to want to basically join the EU, even though the EU in and of itself has all kinds of problems, and that they won't, their fantasy of the EU is not the same as the reality. But being part of this great extended land empire that was once the Soviet Union, shrunk down in 1991, but is still within Russia, there are still, quasi republics inside it that potentially could potentially split up even more. And this is also, by the way, it is a imperialist struggle of a different kind than the U.S. imperialist. So you have two imperialisms that are in conflict with each other. but it is not as so. I just got into a couple arguments today on Twitter about this use of the word proxy war, or I've seen one was not an argument, the other one was an argument, but one was just a statement about Aaron Mate. So Aaron Mate is one of these post-left people who now spout the propaganda of Putin, and we also have now Code Pink, which is an organization that you could say is an anti-imperialist, pro-peace, anti-militarist organization that has a storied history in the United States and is generally correct on many anti-U.S. Issues. The U.S. I'm not a big fan of U.S. foreign policy 90% of the time. Okay, so I often would agree with Code Pink, but on Ukraine they are totally out to lunch. They are they don't understand. They don't see that there are two imperialisms involved, and you don't want to side with. In this case, there is for Ukraine, there's a slightly better imperialism. Not most slightly, it's quite a bit better, the U.S., partly because of the location of Ukraine, partly because, unfortunately, it's mostly white. Okay, so this is also an issue. So, but they can't help it. Ukrainians can't help it, how they look and so forth and so on. So, not all of them are, but most of them are. So, but anyway, so that it just doesn't fit these people. Like, so Medea Benjamin, who's one of the key Code Pink people, is doing is talking this up. And I was just at a demonstration where Code Pink people were putting on stickers onto people, which were basically, it was a climate demonstration, but they were pointing out the U.S. military's. Basically, there was a Ukraine element to it. Okay, I'm forgetting exactly what the sticker said, but it didn't say support Russia, so forth and so on, or don't support Ukraine. But it's become they are putting into their Procrustean bed the anti-imperial, quote unquote, anti-imperialist, the not really anti-U.S. imperialist. Okay, all right, I get it is anti-U.S. imperialist, but pro-Russian imperialist. So if you want to be anti-imperialist, you got to figure this one out. Okay, you can't just, because there's two imperialisms that are fighting over Ukraine, and the Ukrainians seem to be showing a marked preference for the U.S. kind of imperialism and the EU kind of imperialism. It's up to them, really. Again, there are claims that these people say, well, no, there's the eastern part of Ukraine that likes Russia and they do want to be part of Russia. Okay, well, we can't know. I mean, with the Russian army occupying that area, we don't know, whether they really want to secede or not. And so, and frankly, again, now I'm showing my preference, so I'm going to be open. So I think, as I'm saying, with Marxism's abandonment of liberalism, or saying that it could do one better than liberalism by simply changing the personnel, going with the negation, of liberalism. So in other words, if you negate liberalism, so this is Hegelian thinking, you get to the higher level, you get to the synthesis. Well, he didn't think of it in great detail. Maybe Hegel really works, maybe it is that way, but no one in the Marxist tradition has worked out how the state works to make a transition to an egalitarian society, regulate an economy in a socialistic or communistic way. It hasn't been figured out. Okay. And that's why the communist societies, the ones that are most successful, like Vietnam and China, really basically just wholesale adopted many, not everything, but many capitalist features to their economy. So, and it's not a socialist or a Soviet in the sense of workers' council worker council directed government. And in some sense, there's more insecurity in parts of those countries than in many capitalist countries in terms of, basically economic insecurity. So it's not a strong social democracy. So it's something else than being a social, deciding, well, we'll be social democrats. It's a little different than that. But anyway, there wasn't the economic and political insights to understand how the state works within the economy, another big theme of Politics 2100. And so all of that, and then also this attitude, this anti-liberal, this arrogance. So it became an arrogance within Marxism that we don't need to worry about that. And so this arrogance, but also, by the way, that arrogance also adopted by fascists from a different perspective. In other words, the fascists don't have a progressive idea about, or a universalistic idea about all of humanity coming together. They are about a nation recovering its glory, and having been oppressed by shady forces and so forth and so on, they are going to, seek their revenge. So this is, but they also have an arrogant, looking down upon the empathy, the soft empathic liberals, and the idea of care and empathy and so forth and so on. They are the hard people who are going to, they're hard and practical, and they are going to stomp upon the effete liberals and Democrats, okay, small d Democrats, doesn't matter the name of the other party. So because they are the hard people who will make, basically the authoritarians who will make the proper decisions about society. So anyway, this anti-liberalism is then the common thread, okay, in both the red and the brown, okay, that are, I'm not saying red has always been this way. In other words, there is a red that is about liberation and about individual development and about, so forth and so on. But in this case, it's evolved to being, and not just individual development, social development and community development, and there's a bunch of different other things, and also liberty, increasing freedom. But that wasn't really very well built into Marxism. Marxism had no theory for it, so it was only by accident that some countries sort of found a little bit of it, and then it was washed away, and so forth and so on. So there was no systematic theory about that, or systematic thinking about it. So, which is why I think critiquing Marx from the ground up is someplace to start. Not because, again, everyone is reading Marx, but simply to rethink how our political theory and this dumb stuff that we're dealing with now got to be so twisted. So anyway, the struggle over Ukraine, in short, is about revaluing the Enlightenment and liberal democracy and so forth and so on, and national self-determination, and also this project called the EU, in terms of getting smaller countries together that can actually become an independent power, could become an independent power from both the U.S. and Russia, okay? And they haven't done that, and they're mostly in the U.S. Orbit, in part because the U.S. has somewhat more of a focus on liberty, but also because it's more capitalistic. So, it's not there's no shining winner, okay, in any of these, okay. But this is where the people of the Ukraine, at least, seem to be wanting to go, and Russia and Putin want them not to go that way. And these quote unquote anti-imperialists in the United States and in other countries, and also these brown neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, and so on, also don't want that to happen either. Okay. And they're colluding with each other. So, or cooperating with each other in some way. Don't want to, that word collusion, unfortunately. But anyway, they're sharing memes with each other. So anyway, I just wanted to elaborate some of these things and also talk about this important thread of unexamined anti-liberalism, and there are there's many many disasters of the communist experiment have to do with this arrogant assumption that Marx could just take over all the good of the bourgeois society and just and just distribute it better, or restructure society, the relations of production, and somehow we'd have a freer society. We might, but you'd have to go about it differently than the way existing communist, Marxist, Leninist movements have done in the past. In fact, one of the things about the Chile 1973 was so exciting was, or 1970, I'm sorry, in Chile, was that a socialist communist coalition was attempting to do things to reform Chile without the revolution or bloodshed, and without have this particular theory, and so there was something very moving about that unfortunately the United States, among others, tried to squelch and stop. So anyway, I just wanted to share some thoughts about these things. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. This is a very long video. I'm very sorry about that. And I look forward to chatting with you if you have some ideas in the comments. And please like the video if there's something in it that you got something out of. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks.